All right, so thank you all for sharing your personal situations here. And it sounded like for each of the examples we heard, it was a lot of temporary stress, right? Because we talk about use stress and we talk about bad stress. Use stress meaning good stress. Good stress occurs when we're making a change in a positive direction, right? If it's something that we're trying to achieve, either financial goals or career goals, or maybe even moving or family goals, there are different things that can happen in a person's life that causes stress. And that's normal, right? Stress is just our body's reaction to something unfamiliar that we're trying to ascertain as to whether it is good or bad. But there are a lot of moving parts and we tend to ruminate on it, and we get our blood pressure up and our heart rate up. And sometimes we might even hyperventilate if it's that stressful. But for the most part, there's an end in sight, right? We recognize that, we know that if we do X, Y, Z, at some point things will start to simmer down, whether it's moving. We talked about moving from state to state or country to country, right? At some point there's an end, and you know that. But what happens when there's no end in sight, right? We can kind of look at that as long-term stress, which is bad for us, right? Because temporarily, stress is good. It shocks our system. It lets us know we're still alive and lets us know that we have a call to action to get something done. And if we can't accomplish that, we tend to go into what's called long-term stress, which could cause stress-induced anxiety, stress-induced depression, and so many other things, which we'll uncover when we get to psychological disorders. So the idea, of course, is to find a happy medium, find a way to reframe that, or figure out a way to understand how temporary stress is supposed to work. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the chapter. Before we get into that, I did ask the question as what kind of emotions that it impacted, the stressful situation impacted. So stress and life events and emotions and motivations, they all kind of go hand in hand, and that's why we cover really all three of them in this chapter. Okay, now to break these out separately, you can have an entire class on motivation. You can have, in fact, I'm teaching an entire class on emotion right now. So we're kind of just skimming the surface with just in broad strokes as to what emotions are and where they come from. But there's a lot more in depth to this. So if you're interested in doing that, certainly sign up for some of these classes that specialize in this. Okay. Oops, I meant to share my screen with you. Oops. All right. So with emotions, we identified a couple emotions that we talked about last lecture, but we're going to talk a little bit more about in this one. So emotion, some of you had talked about emotions as being irritability, as being happy, as being sad. And all those are valid emotions. Every emotion is valid. We feel them. Therefore, we can't really dispense of them easily. And I hear that a lot, that somebody might tell me they need to control their emotions. They need to control their anger. That's an unrealistic expectation. I'll get to that here in a little bit. So your book describes emotion as feeling part of the unconscious or of the consciousness. Okay, so we're aware most of the time. We're aware of how we feel, right? Emotion is an expression of that feeling. Okay, we may not know, just looking at a person, we may know or we may not know how that person is feeling, right? They may be feeling sad. Depending on how they express their emotion, we may not know that at all. But some people get really skilled at showing the world, the outside world, something that isn't them. Maybe they're in a customer service position where they always have to be smiling and be happy. And somehow, somewhere beneath that surface, beneath that smile, they might be sad or angry or depressed or something like that. So it's very important that we have the capability and the awareness of, yeah, maybe sometimes I have to put on a happy face, but I also need to express myself because that's important too. Okay. So the three elements of emotion that your book talked about is physical arousal, behavior that reveals emotion, and inner awareness of feelings. Okay. So we talked about it. Some of you described feeling irritable, right? That's good because you recognize that you feel that way. Now, what does irritable look like? Can I ask? What are some signs that internally, like you as, yeah, you know you're irritable. What does that look like for you? How does that feel?
I would get like annoyed with everyone around me, just with anything they do.
Okay. Okay. So you would just know, like sometimes I can be a little bit more tolerant, but this time I'm not. So that would be an indication to you that you're irritable. What about, so that's inner awareness of the feeling, right? So outward appearances. So if somebody is irritable, what would you say they're presenting? What are they looking like? What are some of their facial expressions? How are they talking? What are they doing? What do you think?
They kind of sound annoyed to me.
They sound annoyed. Okay.
Yeah,
What
like
does that sound like?
mm, like monotone, like just
Oh,
don't talk to me, kind of like like
come
that.
on, just I'll give you
Yeah.
whatever you want. Get away from me, kind of that, just you kind of see their upper lip get thin, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. What else? What are some? How does a person? You said monotone. How else would they talk, or what other like physical behaviors would you see?
Kind of like snapping at people around them, kind of being aggressive and short at people around them, even if they're not meaning to, it just kind of comes out because of the way that they're feeling and what they're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. You'd see an element of agitation, right? They would be short fused. They might be a little louder even. They might say something off color or derogatory to somebody that they normally wouldn't say. So we can see that shift in personality, and oftentimes it takes us to know that person to know what their capabilities are. Um, and then physical arousal, some things we might see are increased heart rate. We might see their face get red. We might see their shoulders come up. I always look for that to see if somebody is heightened in arousal because their shoulders are like this or their body is tense in some way. So that's one of the ways that I can tell. So physiology of emotion. And I apologize here. I'm going to take a quick break here because it is I was getting a nice breeze in here and all of a sudden it just started getting hot. So I need to turn on some air conditioning, hopefully. All right. Are you all able to hear the air conditioning or is it interfering at all?
No, it's fine.
Okay. All right, cool. Sorry, just had it gets a little hot. I'm up on one of the upper floors, so it gets a little hot in my office. All right. So with the physiology of emotion, we have two systems. Well, one system that is implicated in activating our sensations. Okay, and that's called our sympathetic nervous system. Now, it may sound familiar, and it is because we talked about it in chapter 2 when we talked about physiology of psychology or biopsychology. So the sympathetic nervous system activates many other systems within us. It increases our liver production. It affects our digestion tract. It increases our heart rate, our blood pressure. It dilates our pupils. It does many things to activate our body into what we call fight or flight, right? And that happens through the amygdala, which is implicated in our fear and facial expressions. So with emotional expression, as you had talked about just a little bit ago, there are various ways to express motions, and we, as experts in the human field, right, we know what somebody's feeling, right, if they're expressing it. What are some examples of somebody being happy? How can we tell if somebody outwardly, what are their physiological responses to being happy?
Smiling, laughing.
Right, energetic, right? They're just feeling good. They've got a kind of a pep in their step, and they're ready to take on the world and be friends with everybody. Happy, joy, kumbaya, whatever you want to add, fill in the blanks there. So we have these expressions that are somewhat universal because we as humans, they're innate to us, meaning that they're natural to us. We're born with them. Like, for example, smiling, laughing, crying. These are all reactions to emotions that just about everybody has. Fear response, right? Disgust, I think we talked a little bit about that in previous chapters. When we have disgust, we tend to do what? What does disgust look like if you were looking at somebody's face?
You sort of like cringe and wrinkle up your own
Yeah.
face and like try to.
Yeah, kind of cringing your nose. What function does disgust have? If we think in terms of evolution, like interacting with our environment.
To keep you away from things that might be poisonous or dangerous,
Right.
So that you don't.
Things that smell bad, feel bad, we get that sense of disgust, and we show it usually the same way as if something smelled bad, right? So if somebody says something that we don't like, we might be disgusted with that, and we'll make usually the same facial expressions. So over the generations, we've adopted these display rules. What is appropriate to show to other people. And as a psychologist, and as somebody that performs or practices therapy, this is something I have to be aware of. And it took some practice for me to watch my facial expressions, not physically watch my facial expressions, but be mindful of my facial expressions. Now, why is that? Why do you think you have to be cautious of that? That's loud.
Because sometimes a certain face you make could mean something else to someone else.
Right, exactly. So if we're thinking cross-culturally, if I make a face about something, that it might be mistaken for something else. So usually within therapy, I'm very conscientious of what some of those faces might be. I'm sorry, hold on. I think it's loud. There we go. I'm sorry. Summer is on its way. I haven't had much practice with my air conditioning unit. All right, and the great part is this is on camera. This is on recording, so I get to laugh at how ridiculous I am. All right. So anyway, during therapy, I'm very mindful of how I present myself to others. So, for example, if somebody told me something surprising, and I felt like they were trying to get a reaction out of me, I don't want to reward that by looking surprised or looking in a way that's rewarding them to think that they can get a reaction out of me whenever they want. So, it's something I have to be very cautious of. If somebody tells me something that's sad for them, but doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot for me, I have to empathize with that. And I have to kind of dig down within me and just put myself in their shoes and say, if I hadn't gone through that loss also, I would also, and this is my first loss, I would also be very sad. So trying to match and mimic those expressions are very important. So we've adopted through our culture, through our society, through our families, we've adopted these display rules and things that are appropriate to show and when, right? All right, so labeling emotions. For the most part, we can identify that several cultures have very similar or identical emotions, and they can be, but yet they can be interpreted subjectively. Okay, they could have subjective feelings with that. So labeling in cultures is something that we look at in this field. So actually, so this is one of the, I just wanted to see what this lecture activity was. All right, so we're going to skip this one. So one of the activities that we do with this group is ask people to find a partner. One member of them will be the expressor. The other one will be the interpreter. The expressor will make facial expressions, a few emotions from the list, and the other will be the interpreter, and they have to identify what those are. So anyway, let's see. Oops. Oh, trying to see how. this would have worked. No, I guess it's not gonna work. All right. Sometimes these work, sometimes they don't. No big deal. I am just not having a great time with technology today. All right. So anyway, generally speaking, we have an idea of what our emotions are, and what they look like externally. All right, with early theories of emotion, we have the common sense theory, right? So many of us, without ever having taken a psychology course or learned about James Lange or Shockter Singer or any of those theorists that came up with the ideas of where emotions come from, might say that when we experience something, when we see, like, for example, on this slide, we have a snarling dog, it leads to an emotion of fear, which then leads to bodily arousal in this case, right? And we can demonstrate that by when we experience something fearful, we begin to say to ourselves, oh my gosh, I'm afraid of this. And then we start shaking, and all sorts of heart rate goes up, and all sorts of crazy things happen within our body, within our autonomic nervous system, right? So that's the common sense theory. That's what a lot of people think happens. However, James Lange did a little bit of research on this and understood that we have to get that fear from somewhere. You know, we do have that automatically, but how do we label that fear? Where does the word fear come from, right? At some point, we had to master the language and then understand what fear is, and then associate that with not only internally what we feel, but also externally what we see. So they came back and proposed that a snarling dog creates an arousal within the person, like an autonomic nervous system arousal. The heart rate goes up, pupils dilate, they experience that fear response in their body physiologically first. And then they ascribe those qualities, those characteristics to fear. Okay, so in essence, what they're kind of reframing this, they're saying, I'm afraid because I'm shaking. Okay, so the dog is causing the shaking, and the person is able to consciously say to themselves, I'm afraid because I'm shaking. And there's a dog there, right? Which was, you know, the kind of the bedrock. It got other theorists thinking, and it wasn't a bad theory there for a while. However, however, Ken and Bard came along and said, you know, we don't know as though that happens that way. And here's why: because there's a delay. There's a delay in both. There's a delay in our fear response. So as soon as we see a snarling dog, we don't automatically start shaking. All right. It takes a while for us to understand what's going on, to evaluate, to appraise what's happening, and then we start shaking. So there's some subcortical brain activity happening because of that delay, is what Ken and Bard said. So what they were proposing, Ken and Bard proposed, is that that ANS arousal in the body happens at the same time that we're appraising that as being fear. Okay, so, and they based it just on that delay that it was occurring. So the snarling dog equates to a little bit of time and processing, and then all of a sudden we start shaking, and at the same time we recognize that fear is occurring. Okay, so within the facial feedback hypothesis is a stimulus such as a snarling dog causes arousal and facial expressions, and the facial expression then provides feedback to the brain about the emotion. The brain then interprets the emotion, and it may also intensify it. Okay, so for example, you see the snarling dog, your autonomic nervous system creates a facial expression, and based on that facial expression, your brain says, hey, you know, our cheeks are like pulled back, you know, our brow is furrowed, we're experiencing fear right now. And it's because the dog caused a facial expression, and we interpret that our own facial expression as being fearful. Okay. And then lastly, no, I'm sorry, not lastly. and second to last, we have the Shockter-Singer cognitive arousal theory. This is known as occurring when the stimulus leads to both bodily arousal and the labeling of that arousal based on the surrounding context, which leads the experience of and labeling of emotional reaction. Okay, so you have the snarling dog. At the same time, you know, it may take a little bit of delay. They kind of go along with Cannon-Bard theory with this. There might be a little bit of a delay there, but we have that cognitive appraisal of what's happening in our environment. And then we experience the bodily sensations at the same time. And based on what's happening in the environment and how our body feels, we say, hey, that's fear. Okay. Kind of similar to the facial recognition and the facial expression theory, right? Except we're taking into account what's happening around us and we're paying attention to what's happening in our body. And then because of our experience with language and other people and social interactions with other people, we recognize that that is fear, right? Let me ask this. What is the difference between fear and anger physiologically? Is there any physiological symptoms? Think of a time when you were fearful and think of a time when you're angry. Take away the thought process that went with that. Just pay attention to what your body sensation was. Were there any differences?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
there's like when I'm angry, it's more of an aggression. When I'm scared, I'm not
Okay.
aggressive towards it. I'm more like running away from it.
Okay. Somebody else was chiming in. What else? What are some other differences physiologically? Not I felt angry. You know, we don't want that. We want to pay attention. You know, what was happening? Like, what are the physiological responses to being angry, and what are the physiological responses to being afraid? What happens in your body? Talked about it a little earlier.
When I'm angry, I tend to try to like get as big as I possibly can, like
Okay.
try to make myself look bigger and stronger and more aggressive and try to scare everything else. And
Okay.
then when I'm scared, I just want to be like small and tiny and hide in a corner.
Okay. So fear is one of those unique ones where, again, we get into that fight or flight, right? When we get into the fight, it looks very similar to anger. Okay. So we can really say that anger and fear are very close cousins. They're very, very close, just because of the physiological response. Now, the reason why I asked you to take how you feel about it, because we've already ascribed to what fear is. You know, fear is when something in our environment causes us to feel like we are about to be in danger, right? So we become fearful of that. We develop that fight or flight reaction. If we develop that fight reaction, it looks very similar to anger. But the only difference is our cognitive appraisal, right? How we appraise that situation and how we feel. And then we say, hey, I'm angry, or hey, I'm afraid, or hey, I'm disgusted, right? So kind of to rephrase what we've been looking at, Shockter-Singer would suggest this snarling dog is dangerous and that makes me feel afraid. Therefore, I'm experiencing fear. Okay. I know these are very close. I'm doing my best to try and delineate them. And then lastly, we have Lazarus cognitive mediational theory, which states the stimulus causes an immediate appraisal. For example, the dog is snarling and not behind a fence, so this is dangerous, right? The cognitive appraisal results in an emotional response, which is then followed by the appropriate bodily response, right? So the snarling dog, again, we're looking at contextual clues in our environment, because just a snarling dog may not be enough to make us run away, right? But if you saw a snarling dog inside of a fence, it probably wouldn't, we wouldn't have the intensity of our fear response that we would if it was outside of that fence and charging towards us, right? So our appraise of the threat and the reality of the threat that it might actually be for us will elicit the intensity of that fear, and then send a second response as our bodily response to act on that. Okay. All right. Any questions on emotional theory? All right. I'm sorry. I think I might actually. No. All right. So what I would like to do, I apologize. I thought I had different slides for this. All right. So let's do this. What I would like to do is let's go back into our groups again. And what I would like to do is have each group, I'm going to give you a different emotion. And we'll break these off into different classifications. So what physiological response looks like. Okay, remember the three things that we looked at: physiological response, physical response, right? So heart rate, breathing, blood pressure, muscle tension, what the physical response would be, what the facial response would be. How can we tell if somebody is that emotion? Okay. And then lastly, physical, emotional. Yeah, let's do that. I'm sorry. Yeah. So physical response, and then what the facial expression would be, how we would recognize that. Okay. And what the internal feelings are. Okay. For that. So three things. Everybody clear on what we're doing? I'm going to give you the emotion. I'll give each group of you the emotion, and then you have to break it down into those three categories and describe them to me in those three categories. We clear? Anybody not clear on what we're doing?
Can you repeat the physical, emotional, and
Yep. So
the
what are
third
the?
one?
So I'm going to give each group one emotion. Okay.
Oh,
so,
three elements of emotion. Okay.
Yep. Yep.
Okay,
So the
sorry.
physical, what the facial features look like, and how the
Yeah.
person might describe feeling internally.
Okay.
Sound good?
Inner awareness of feeling and behavioral that reveals.
Yeah. Yeah. In
Okay.
fact, maybe if you want to take a screenshot of this slide, let me get back to that slide.
I wrote it down, so.
Oh, you got it? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I
All
don't know
right.
if anyone else wrote it down, but
All right. Anybody else need that, or they good? All right. So Bridget Duffy or Bridget Casey. Oh yeah, Bridget and Casey. You're both on here, right?
Yes.
Okay. So let me pause recording here.